Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make you appreciate those grainy security cameras on every street corner. We're diving into the chaotic, brutal, and often hilariously incompetent world of criminal investigations before anyone could just check the tape. Before DNA evidence, before fingerprints, before even basic forensics, how did anyone catch a criminal? Spoiler alert, they usually didn't. But when they did, the methods were equal parts clever, disturbing, and absolutely bonkers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin. You've just witnessed a murder in ancient Rome, circa 50 BCE. Blood pools on the cobblestones, a body lies crumpled near the forum, and you're standing there, mouth agape, wondering what happens next. In our modern world, the area would be cordoned off with yellow tape, forensic teams would swarm the scene, and detectives would start collecting evidence. But this is ancient Rome, friend. There's no crime scene preservation here. There's barely even a concept of a crime scene. Instead, what you get is instant chaos. Crowds gather not to gawk from behind barriers, but to trample directly through any potential evidence. That blood, it's already been stepped in by 40 different sandals. The murder weapon, probably picked up by some opportunistic thief who saw a free knife. Any witnesses? They're either fleeing because they don't want to get involved, or they're busy rifling through the victim's purse because, hey, he's not using it anymore. The first investigator on scene isn't a detective. It's likely the local vigilas, Rome's firefighting night watch, who doubled as the world's most reluctant police force. These guys were primarily concerned with preventing fires, not solving murders. Their investigation technique: grab the nearest suspicious-looking person, usually a slave or a foreigner, and declare the case closed. Justice served, Roman style. But let's say this victim was important, maybe a senator or a wealthy merchant. Then things get interesting. Not CSI interesting. But let's torture some slaves until someone confesses. Interesting. Because in ancient Rome, the testimony of slaves was only considered valid if extracted under torture. That's right, their entire investigative philosophy was based on the assumption that people only tell the truth when you're breaking their fingers. The scene itself? Forget about photographing it or measuring blood spatter patterns. If you're lucky, someone might remember which direction the murderer ran. More likely, you'll get 17 different versions of events, each more elaborate than the last. I saw him. He was 7 feet tall, with glowing eyes and the head of a wolf. Thanks, Claudius. Very helpful. And here's the real kicker. There was no centralized police force, no detective division, no systematic approach to investigation. If you wanted justice, you basically had to investigate the crime yourself or hire someone to do it for you. Imagine being both the victim's family and the lead detective on the case. No pressure there. Evidence collection was essentially non-existent. Nobody was dusting for fingerprints because nobody knew what fingerprints were. The concept of physical evidence beyond "this is the bloody knife we found" simply didn't exist. Instead, investigations relied on 3 things: eyewitnesses who were notoriously unreliable, confessions usually obtained through creative interrogation methods, and good old-fashioned assumptions based on who looked guilty. The Romans did have one investigative tool that seems almost modern: the informant network. The delatores were professional informants who made their living by reporting crimes and collecting rewards. Sounds reasonable, right? Except, these charming individuals often fabricated crimes wholesale, accusing innocent people for profit. It was like having a police force made entirely of people trying to frame you for reward money. So when you witnessed that murder in the forum, your best bet wasn't to wait for justice. It was to run. because there was a decent chance you'd end up blamed for it just for being there. Welcome to criminal investigation, ancient style, where evidence was optional, torture was standard procedure, and justice was whoever could afford the best accusation. Fast forward 1,000 years, and you might think criminal investigation would have improved. You'd be catastrophically wrong. Welcome to medieval Europe, where solving crimes was less about investigation and more about asking God to point out the guilty party. Literally. Picture this. It's 1347. You're in a small English village, and the baker has been found dead in his shop, head caved in with what appears to be his own rolling pin. In modern times, detectives would dust that rolling pin for fingerprints, interview witnesses, check alibis. In medieval England, the first step is to raise the hue and cry. The hue and cry was basically medieval crowdsourcing for law enforcement. When a crime was discovered, whoever found it had to immediately start screaming. Not just any screaming, mind you, but a specific type of alarm that would alert the entire village. Every able-bodied man within earshot was legally required to drop whatever they were doing and join the chase. Imagine a flash mob, but instead of dancing, everyone's running after some poor sod who may or may not have committed a crime. But here's where it gets properly medieval. If you didn't join the hue and cry, you could be fined. If you raised a false hue and cry, you could be fined. If the criminal escaped because your hue wasn't cry enough, the entire village could be fined. It was essentially a game of legal hot potato, where everyone was constantly at risk of punishment. Once the suspected criminal was caught, and let's be honest, it was usually just whoever looked most suspicious or ran the fastest, the real investigation began. And by investigation, I mean a series of increasingly bizarre tests designed to let God sort out guilt or innocence. Enter the trial by ordeal, the medieval equivalent of flipping a coin but with significantly more burns. The accused would be subjected to various painful tests, the logic being that God would protect the innocent. Hot iron ordeal? You'd carry a burning hot iron bar for 9 paces. If your hands healed cleanly after 3 days, you were innocent. If they festered, which they almost always did because medieval hygiene was essentially non-existent, you were guilty. The cold water ordeal was equally ridiculous. You'd be tied up and thrown in the river. If you floated, you were guilty because water, being pure, rejected sinners. If you sank, you were innocent. Congratulations on your innocence. Hope you enjoyed drowning. But let's say you wanted something approaching actual investigation. Your best bet was the coroner. And no, not the modern medical examiner type. Medieval coroners were royal officials whose main job was making sure the king got his cut of any fines or confiscated property. They'd show up, look at the body, ask a few questions, and mainly focus on determining if there was any money to be made from the death. The coroner's investigation technique was surprisingly straightforward. Gather 12 local men as a jury and make them swear an oath about what they thought happened. Not what they knew, not what evidence suggested, but what they thought. These jurors weren't selected for their investigative skills or impartiality. They were just local guys who probably knew both the victim and the accused, bringing all their personal biases and village grudges to the table. Witness testimony was king, but with a medieval twist. Your credibility wasn't based on what you saw or your reputation for honesty. It was based on how many people you could get to swear you were telling the truth. These oath helpers didn't need to have witnessed anything. They just had to be willing to risk their souls by swearing you weren't lying. The more oath helpers you had, the more likely you were to win your case. And if you were a woman, good luck. Your testimony was worth less than a man's, if it was accepted at all. You couldn't serve on juries, couldn't be a legal witness in many cases, and if you were accused of a crime, your options were even more limited. Though you did have one special judicial avenue. You could claim to be pregnant. Courts would delay execution until after birth, giving you 9 months to figure out an escape plan or hope everyone forgot about you. Evidence, as we understand it, barely existed. There were no photographs, no forensics, no paper trails. Physical evidence was limited to, here's the murder weapon, or look, bloodstains. But since everyone had knives and bloodstains were as common as mud in medieval life, this wasn't particularly helpful. The real investigators of medieval England were the gossips, the nosy neighbors, and the vengeful relatives. They'd gather information, spread rumors, and essentially conduct trial by public opinion. If enough people thought you did it, you probably did it. If the victim's family was powerful enough to push for your conviction, you definitely did it. So that baker's murder, it was probably solved within hours. The village would chase down whoever seemed guiltiest, subject them to some water-based divine judgment, and call it justice. The actual murderer? They were probably in the crowd, helping with the hue and cry, secure in the knowledge that medieval investigation was less about finding the truth and more about finding someone, anyone, to blame. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, you might expect criminal investigation to have evolved into something more sophisticated. After all, this was the age of Leonardo da Vinci, scientific revolution, and intellectual awakening. Surely someone had figured out a better system than throwing people in rivers to see if they float? Well, yes and no. Mostly no. It's 1482 in Florence, and you've just discovered your wealthy merchant neighbor lying in a pool of blood, an ornate dagger protruding from his chest. The good news? Renaissance city-states actually had something resembling organized law enforcement. The bad news? These organizations were less concerned with solving crimes and more focused on maintaining political power and collecting bribes. In Florence, you'd be dealing with the Auto di Guardia, the aide of watch. These weren't trained investigators. They were political appointees, usually wealthy merchants or minor nobles who bought their positions and saw law enforcement as a side business to their real job of getting richer. Their investigation method? Start with whoever owed the victim money, then work through political enemies, then check if any Jews or foreigners were conveniently nearby to blame. But here's where the Renaissance gets interesting. For the first time in history, people were actually writing down investigative procedures. The bad news? These procedures were absolutely insane. Take the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. While technically a guide for investigating witchcraft, its methods were applied to all sorts of crimes. According to this delightful manual, proper investigation included stripping suspects naked to look for devil's marks, torturing confessions out of people using increasingly creative methods, and accepting spectral evidence, which is basically, I saw them do it in a dream. The Renaissance did give us one major investigative innovation: the post-mortem examination. Not quite an autopsy, mind you, but at least someone was finally looking at bodies for clues beyond, yep, that's definitely a stab wound. University-trained physicians might examine corpses, noting wounds, checking for poisons, and occasionally making surprisingly accurate observations. In 1302, Bartolomeo da Varignana performed what's considered the first recorded forensic autopsy in Bologna, determining that a nobleman had been poisoned rather than dying naturally. This was groundbreaking stuff. For the first time, someone was using medical knowledge to investigate crime. Of course, his methods included tasting the victim's organs for bitterness. So maybe don't get too excited about Renaissance forensics. The real investigators of the Renaissance were often not officials at all, but private individuals hired by families or guilds. These searchers, or finders, were like medieval private detectives if private detectives had no legal authority, no investigative training, and a disturbing willingness to use torture. Your murdered merchant case would likely proceed like this. The Auto di Guardia would arrive, note the obvious wealth of the victim, and immediately start calculating fines and confiscations. They'd question witnesses, but Renaissance witness examination was an art form of leading questions and assumed guilt. "When did you see the accused commit this murder?" was considered a perfectly reasonable opening question. Physical evidence was finally being considered, but in the most Renaissance way possible. Bloodstain patterns? Irrelevant. But the astrological significance of the murder weapon? Now we're talking. The position of Jupiter at the time of death could be considered more important than eyewitness testimony. Investigators might consult astrologers, alchemists, and local wise women for insights, turning murder investigation into a weird fusion of science, superstition, and creative guesswork. The Renaissance also gave us the delightful innovation of torture as an investigative tool. Not just random torture, but systematic, legally regulated torture. The strappado, where victims were hoisted by their wrists tied behind their backs. The rack, for that full-body stretching experience. Water torture, thumb screws, and devices I won't describe because YouTube has policies. All perfectly legal investigative techniques, provided you followed proper procedures and had a notary present to record the screams. I mean, confessions. And here's the truly Renaissance twist. They were starting to document everything obsessively. Court records, witness testimonies, confessions extracted under torture, all carefully written down and preserved. We know so much about Renaissance crime because they couldn't stop writing about it. Every accusation, every investigation, every execution meticulously recorded by clerks who probably wished they'd studied accounting instead. But perhaps the most Renaissance innovation was the use of informant networks that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. Every major city had elaborate spy networks with citizens paid to report on their neighbors. Venice's Council of Ten had so many informants that they installed special mail slots, bocca di leone, lions' mouths, where anonymous denunciations could be dropped. Your morning could start with an anonymous note accusing you of murder, sodomy, or wearing overly fancy clothes, all equally serious crimes in Renaissance minds. So, your merchant's murder? It would generate reams of paperwork, involve at least 3 conflicting astrological readings, probably result in someone being tortured until they confessed to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed, and definitely end with the victim's property being confiscated by the state. The actual murderer? They probably wrote the anonymous denunciation that started the investigation, framing their business rival while the auto de guardia was too busy calculating their take to notice. Progress? Sure, if you count writing down our terrible investigative methods as progress. But hey, at least they were trying to be systematic about their incompetence. That's the Renaissance for you, taking medieval barbarism and adding paperwork. Welcome to Tudor England, where criminal investigation reached new heights of brutality and bureaucracy. It's 1547. Henry VIII just died, probably from being Henry VIII, and you're unfortunate enough to discover a corpse in London's Southwark district. What happens next will make you long for the simple days of trial by ordeal. The Tudors had professionalized paranoia into an art form, with religious upheaval, constant plots against the crown, and a general atmosphere of anyone could be a traitor. Criminal investigation had evolved from haphazard medieval justice into something far more terrifying: organized, systematic persecution with documentation. Your first encounter would be with the local constable, an unpaid position rotated among respectable citizens who wanted nothing more than to finish their year of service without getting stabbed, sued, or accused of treason. These reluctant law enforcers had no training, no resources, and no real authority beyond, "I'm the constable this year, please listen to me." But here's where Tudor investigation gets interesting. The coroner's inquest had evolved into something approaching actual investigation. The coroner would arrive, usually within a day, to view the body. This wasn't just a casual glance anymore. Tudor coroners were starting to note specific wounds, their locations, possible weapons, and even time of death based on decomposition. Of course, they were still completely wrong about most things. Time of death was determined by checking if the body was cold as clay or warm as wool. Cause of death included such medical mysteries as visitation by God or sudden frighting. But hey, at least they were writing it down. The Tudor innovation that changed everything? The Justice of the Peace. These were local gentry appointed by the crown with actual legal powers. They could issue warrants, examine witnesses, and even conduct preliminary trials. Think of them as amateur detectives with the power to hang you. Their investigative technique was a fascinating mix of medieval superstition and emerging legal procedure. They'd take written depositions, a major advance from the whoever shouts loudest wins medieval approach. But they'd also employ such cutting-edge investigative techniques as checking if the corpse bled when the suspected murderer touched it. This cruentation was considered legitimate evidence. The logic? Dead bodies recognize their killers and express their displeasure through spontaneous bleeding. Science? Making suspects swear elaborate oaths on the Bible. Not just any Bible, mind you, but specific Bibles believed to have curse powers. Lying while touching the Darley Bible, for instance, was thought to cause immediate divine punishment. Spoiler, it didn't. Using swimming tests that were basically refined versions of medieval water ordeals. The Tudor twist? They measured exactly how long you floated and at what angle. Floating for more than 10 minutes at a 45-degree angle? Definitely guilty. Sinking immediately? Probably innocent, definitely drowned. But the real Tudor contribution to criminal investigation was the network of informants that would make the Stasi jealous. In an age where being the wrong religion could get you burned at the stake, everyone was watching everyone. Professional informants called promoters made their living accusing people of crimes. Your neighbor could report you for not attending church, reading the wrong books, or making suspicious comments about the Queen's marriage choices. The genius of Tudor investigation was making everyone a potential investigator. Church wardens monitored religious compliance. Ale tasters, yes, that was a real job, reported on tavern conversations. Midwives were required to report suspicious births or miscarriages. Every profession had a secondary role: spy for the state. Physical evidence was finally being collected, though not in any way we'd recognize. Murder weapons were brought to trial, but mainly so witnesses could dramatically point at them. Bloody clothing was preserved, not for forensic analysis, but so jurors could see how very bloody it was. Documents were becoming crucial evidence, especially in treason cases, leading to a boom in both forgery and handwriting analysis. The Tudors even pioneered psychological investigation, though they called it examining the conscience. Suspects would be questioned repeatedly, their answers compared for inconsistencies. Sleep deprivation was a favorite technique. Keep someone awake for 3 days, and they'd confess to anything, including murders that happened before they were born. And then there was torture. Oh, the Tudors loved their torture. But it was legal torture, regulated torture, torture with paperwork. The rack in the Tower of London came with an operator's manual and required authorization from the Privy Council. You couldn't just torture anyone. You needed proper documentation first. The most feared Tudor investigators were the pursuivants, agents of the state who hunted religious dissidents. These men were professionals, trained in search techniques, interrogation, and the fine art of finding hidden priests in country houses. They pioneered what we'd now call crime scene investigation, meticulously searching homes for evidence of Catholic practices, hidden altars, banned books, suspicious candle wax patterns. They developed techniques for finding priest holes, those hidden chambers where Catholic priests would hide during raids. They'd measure rooms to find discrepancies, tap walls, listening for hollow sounds, and even use primitive sound detection by placing pans of water on floors to detect vibrations from hidden occupants. So that corpse in Southwark. Within hours, you'd have a constable grudgingly taking notes, a coroner measuring wounds with his thumb, a justice of the peace interrogating everyone in sight, and probably 3 different informants claiming they saw the whole thing and know exactly who did it. For a price. The investigation would generate dozens of written documents, involve at least 1 swimming test, and definitely end with someone being hanged. Though whether it was the actual murderer was anybody's guess. The Tudors had turned criminal investigation from a haphazard medieval mess into an organized early modern mess. Progress? Well, they were keeping better records of their incompetence. And really, isn't that what civilization is all about? By the 1640s, England had descended into civil war, and with political chaos came a special kind of investigative madness, the age of the witch-finders. If you thought Tudor investigation was bad, wait until you meet Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed witchfinder general who turned paranoia into a profitable business model. Picture this. It's 1645 in Essex, and old widow Marjorie has been accused of witchcraft because her neighbor's cow died. In comes Hopkins, a failed lawyer with a flair for the dramatic and an expense account that would make modern consultants weep with envy. His investigative methods were so thoroughly documented, so systematically cruel, and so bizarrely specific that they deserve their own special place in the Hall of Investigative Shame. Hopkins didn't just investigate witches, he manufactured them with assembly line efficiency. His techniques included the infamous watching method. Suspects would be stripped naked, placed on a stool in the middle of a room, and watched continuously for days. No sleep, no food, minimal water. The investigators would wait for their familiars, demon pets, to appear. When exhausted victims started hallucinating from sleep deprivation, every imaginary spider or mouse became evidence of supernatural guilt. Pricking for the devil's mark. Hopkins employed professional prickers who would jab suspects with special needles, looking for spots that didn't bleed or feel pain. These entrepreneurs often used retractable needles, ensuring they always found what they were looking for. It was like a twisted magic show where the reveal was always guilty of witchcraft. The swimming test reached new heights of pseudo-scientific ridiculousness. Hopkins had specific protocols. The right thumb tied to the left toe, left thumb to right toe, creating a human pretzel. The logic? This cross-formation would prevent witches from using satanic swimming techniques. They even had mathematical formulas for buoyancy relative to body weight. If you floated for more than 15 minutes, clearly guilty. If you sank and drowned, well, at least you died innocent. But here's where Hopkins was genuinely innovative. He documented everything obsessively. Every accusation, every test, every confession was recorded in detail. He wrote instruction manuals for other witchfinders, creating a standardized system of supernatural investigation. It was franchising before franchising existed, except the product was human misery. His account books survived, showing he charged towns 20 shillings per witch discovered, plus expenses. In Aldeburgh he billed for watching and walking 3 witches, plus accommodation, meals, and horse feed. The man was running a traveling horror show and submitting itemized invoices. The confessions he extracted were masterpieces of leading questions and exhausted delusion. Women would admit to flying to Sabbaths on broomsticks, having sexual relations with the devil, who was apparently terrible in bed and cold as ice, and cursing their neighbors' butter churns. Hopkins carefully recorded every detail, building a database of supernatural crime that would be hilarious if it hadn't killed so many people. His investigations followed a pattern. Arrive in town, give a rousing speech about hidden witches, collect accusations, usually from people with grudges, conduct his tests, extract confessions, collect payment, and leave before anyone asked too many questions. It was like a medieval consulting firm, but instead of PowerPoints, he had drowning stools. The really terrifying part? Hopkins wasn't operating in secret. He had semi-official backing, published his methods in a book called The Discovery of Witches, and was seen as a legitimate investigator by many authorities. Local magistrates, desperate to appear tough on witchcraft, welcomed his expertise. He turned superstition into system, fear into profit, and investigation into performance art. His techniques spread beyond England. The Salem witch trials in America would later use similar methods, proving that bad investigative techniques like bad fashion tend to make unfortunate comebacks. Water tests, sleep deprivation, and looking for devil's marks became standard investigative tools across the Atlantic. But Hopkins' reign of investigative terror was relatively short. By 1647, public opinion was turning. Some brave souls started asking uncomfortable questions like, why do all these witches seem to be poor old women? And, isn't it suspicious that Hopkins always finds exactly as many witches as a town can afford to pay for? Legend says Hopkins himself was eventually subjected to his own swimming test and floated, proving by his own logic that he was a witch. He probably actually died of tuberculosis, billing some poor town for witch-finding services until his last breath. But the legend is more poetically just. The Witchfinder era represents the absolute nadir of criminal investigation. When profit motive meets superstition, meets systematic cruelty, all wrapped up in official-looking documentation. These weren't investigators seeking truth. They were entrepreneurs selling fear, using investigative techniques that were really just creative ways to torture confessions out of innocent people. So next time you complain about police procedures, remember, at least they're not tying your thumb to your opposite toe and throwing you in a pond to see if you float. Progress, such as it is. By the 1700s, London had grown into a sprawling metropolis of crime, gin, and more crime. With nearly 1 million souls crammed into a city with no organized police force, criminal investigation had evolved from chase whoever looks guilty to maybe we should write down who looks guilty first. Enter the Bow Street Runners, the world's first professional police force, if you define professional very, very loosely. It's 1750, and you've just been robbed in Covent Garden. In medieval times, you'd raise the hue and cry. In Tudor times, you'd find a constable and hope he wasn't drunk. But now you could go to Bow Street and hire yourself a runner. The Bow Street Runners were the brainchild of Henry Fielding, a magistrate who also wrote novels, because apparently being a judge wasn't interesting enough. Fielding realized that London's crime problem needed more than part-time constables and wishful thinking. It needed professional thief-takers who actually knew what they were doing. Sort of. These runners were essentially private detectives available for hire, operating out of Fielding's magistrate court at No. 4 Bow Street. For a fee, they would investigate your crime, track down criminals, and recover stolen property. Think of them as Uber for law enforcement, but with more violence and significantly fewer customer reviews. Their investigative techniques were revolutionary for the time, which is to say they actually had some. They kept records. The Bow Street office maintained a register of pursuit, listing crimes, suspects, and stolen goods. For the first time in history, investigators could check if that suspiciously wealthy pickpocket had been suspiciously wealthy before. It was like a criminal database, if databases were handwritten ledgers that smelled like pipe tobacco and despair. They shared information through the Hue and Cry, a newspaper that listed recent crimes and wanted persons. Imagine Twitter for crime, but published weekly and requiring literacy. Runners would send descriptions of criminals to other towns, creating the first interjurisdictional cooperation. Wanted, Tom the Knife. Identifying features has knife, named Tom. They used informants systematically. The runners maintained networks of criminals who would sell information for reduced sentences or straight cash. They hung out in taverns, brothels, and gaming houses, which they insisted was strictly professional. The fact that their expense accounts included astronomical bar tabs was merely coincidental. But here's where it gets properly 18th century. The runners were also in business with the criminals. Many operated as thief-takers who would negotiate the return of stolen goods for a finder's fee. Steal a gentleman's watch, sell it to a runner for 20% of its value. The runner returns it for a 50% reward. Everyone profits except the victim, who pays to get their own property back. It was basically a protection racket with legal backing. The most famous runner was probably John Townsend, who dressed like a dandy, carried a gold-tipped staff, and solved through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and actually being quite clever. He pioneered the technique of criminal profiling, though his version was more "which tavern would I rob people in if I were a highwayman" than modern psychological analysis. Physical evidence was finally being taken seriously, though still in adorably primitive ways. Runners would preserve footprints by placing wooden frames around them, though what they did with these framed footprints afterward is unclear. They collected weapons, examined wounds, and even attempted basic ballistics by firing pistols into clay to compare bullet marks. The runners also pioneered undercover work, infiltrating criminal gangs with disguises that range from convincing to "that's obviously a policeman in a false beard." They attended criminal flash houses where stolen goods were traded, sometimes arresting everyone, sometimes just taking notes for future reference, depending on how their investments were doing. Their investigative process for a typical robbery would go something like this. Interview the victim, focusing mainly on what reward they're offering. Take detailed notes about the stolen items, especially valuable ones. Check their network of informants to see if anyone's suddenly spending money. Visit known receivers of stolen goods with whom they had excellent professional relationships. Negotiate with the thief through intermediaries for the return of goods. Arrest someone, not necessarily the actual thief, to show they're doing their job. Collect reward, submit expense report for investigative drinking. The Bow Street Runners lasted until 1839, when they were absorbed into the new Metropolitan Police. By then, they had investigated thousands of crimes, with a success rate that was actually impressive for the time, even if half their successes involved crimes they had arguably facilitated. But their real legacy was proving that professional investigation could work. They showed that keeping records, sharing information, and maintaining networks of contacts could actually solve crimes. They pioneered techniques that would become standard: surveillance, undercover work, criminal databases, and expense account fraud. Were they corrupt? Absolutely. Were they effective? Sometimes. Were they better than anything that came before? Definitely. The Bow Street Runners represented the awkward adolescence of criminal investigation. No longer childlike medieval chaos, not yet modern professional policing, but something weird and fascinating in between. So that robbery in Covent Garden? A runner would take your case, drink your money's worth of gin while investigating, probably know exactly who robbed you because they'd had drinks with them last Tuesday, negotiate your property's return for a hefty fee, and maybe arrest some random Irish guy to make quota. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was systematic injustice, and that's progress of a sort. By the 1840s, London had done something unprecedented. Created an actual police force. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, had replaced the Bow Street Runners with uniformed officers who were supposedly incorruptible. Spoiler alert, they weren't. But they did bring something new to criminal investigation. The radical idea that maybe, just maybe, you could solve crimes using actual evidence and reasoning instead of torture, superstition, or whoever looked guiltiest. It's 1888. Jack the Ripper is making headlines, and you're about to see Victorian investigation at its finest, which is to say, still pretty terrible, but with better documentation and significantly more pompous mustaches. The Victorian era gave us the first real detectives in the modern sense. The Metropolitan Police established the Detective Department in 1842, starting with just 8 men who wore plain clothes and were viewed with deep suspicion by both criminals and the public. Detectives? In disguise? Spying on honest Englishmen? It seemed positively French. These early detectives pioneered investigative techniques that seem quaint now, but were revolutionary then. The crime scene photograph. By the 1860s, police were using the new technology of photography to document murder scenes. Of course, exposure times were so long that photographers had to ask corpses to hold still. The photos were black and white, grainy, and usually featured at least one constable who'd accidentally wandered into frame, but they were evidence you could hold in your hand. Anthropometry, or the Bertillon system. This French innovation involved taking 11 precise body measurements to identify criminals: height, arm span, sitting height, head width, left foot length, etc. The theory was that no two people would have identical measurements. The practice was that measuring squirming criminals with 19th century tools was about as accurate as guessing their star sign. But it looked very scientific, with charts and calipers and everything. The first criminal databases. Scotland Yard began maintaining photographic records of known criminals, creating rogues galleries that detectives could browse like the world's most depressing photo album. They also kept registers of criminal methods, noting that Birmingham Dave prefers jimmying windows while Southwark Pete favors roof entry. It was criminal profiling, Victorian style. Telegraphic communication. For the first time, police forces could communicate quickly across distances. A criminal who committed a crime in London could have his description telegraphed to Dover before he reached the port. Of course, the descriptions were often medium height, brown hair, suspicious demeanor, which described roughly half of England. But the real Victorian innovation was in attitude. Detectives began approaching crime scientifically, or at least what Victorians considered scientific. They took notes obsessively, measured everything measurable, and theorized endlessly. Inspector Frederick Aberline, investigating the Ripper murders, filled notebooks with observations, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and created detailed maps of crime scenes. The problem was Victorian detectives were still Victorians. Their scientific approach was filtered through spectacular biases. They believed in physiognomy, the science of determining criminal tendencies from facial features. Large jaw, obviously violent. Close-set eyes, definitely dishonest. Foreign-looking, guilty of something, surely. They also suffered from Victorian moral certainty. Prostitutes were fallen women whose testimony was inherently unreliable. Poor people were naturally criminal. Rich people were occasionally criminal, but probably had good reasons. These biases shaped every investigation. Take the Jack the Ripper case. The police response showcased both the best and worst of Victorian investigation. On the positive side, they preserved crime scenes, eventually, took photographs, conducted door-to-door inquiries, and even attempted primitive profiling. They theorized the killer had medical knowledge based on the mutilations, lived locally based on escape routes, and was probably a man of solitary habits subject to periodic attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, which was Victorian for a really messed up dude. On the negative side, they also arrested every suspicious-looking foreigner, consulted psychics, and spent considerable time investigating whether the murders were a Jewish ritual. They weren't. They ignored witness testimony from prostitutes, bungled evidence collection, and were so eager for leads they fell for obvious hoaxes, including the infamous Dear Boss letter that gave Jack the Ripper his name. Victorian detectives also pioneered surveillance techniques, though their version involved obviously following suspects while wearing slightly different hats and hoping no one noticed. They developed networks of informants in the criminal underworld, paying for information with a combination of money and threats. They even attempted early forensic analysis, studying bloodstains and wound patterns, though their conclusions were often wildly wrong. The era also saw the rise of private detectives, inspired by fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes. These private inquiry agents handled cases the police wouldn't touch: adultery, blackmail, missing persons who weren't worth official attention. Their methods were often more flexible than police procedures, which is Victorian for legally questionable. By the 1890s, criminal investigation had transformed from medieval chaos to something recognizably modern. There were procedures, protocols, and even training manuals. The police code instructed officers on everything from preserving footprints, cover them with a box, to interviewing witnesses, be polite but firm. But the most important Victorian contribution to investigation was the idea that crimes could be solved through observation, deduction, and evidence rather than confessions, ordeals, or divine intervention. They were often wrong in their deductions, hilariously biased in their observations, and terrible at preserving evidence, but they were trying to be systematic. That's more than anyone had done before. So that murder in Whitechapel, Victorian detectives would photograph the scene badly, measure the wounds inaccurately, interview witnesses selectively, check their criminal records incomplete, develop theories, probably wrong, and eventually arrest someone, possibly guilty. It wasn't perfect, but compared to throwing suspects in rivers to see if they float, it was practically CSI London. The Victorian era, when criminal investigation finally grew up, put on a proper coat and started taking notes. Even if those notes were often, "Foreigners seem suspicious," and perhaps check if the moon was full. Progress is progress, even when it's wearing a top hat and moralizing about fallen women. As the 19th century drew to a close, criminal investigation stood on the brink of its greatest revolution. But like all revolutions, this one started with spectacular incompetence, bureaucratic infighting, and a healthy dose of colonial racism. Welcome to the birth of fingerprinting, where the future of forensic science was almost strangled in its crib by Victorian stubbornness. It's 1892 in Argentina, and Francisca Rojas has just reported that a man named Velázquez murdered her 2 children. The local police inspector, Eduardo Alvarez, has been reading about this new fingerprint nonsense from some Argentine statistician named Juan Vucetich. On a whim, he checks the bloody fingerprint on the doorframe. Plot twist. It's Rojas's print. She confesses, becomes the first person convicted by fingerprint evidence, and history is made. But if you think this breakthrough led to immediate worldwide adoption of fingerprinting, you've clearly never dealt with Victorian bureaucracy. Back in the British Empire, fingerprinting had actually been discovered decades earlier by William Herschel, a colonial administrator in India who used fingerprints to stop Bengali workers from claiming their pensions twice. Because, of course, the British would discover a revolutionary forensic technique while trying to prevent welfare fraud. Meanwhile, Francis Galton, yes, Darwin's cousin and the father of eugenics because Victorian science was complicated, was studying fingerprints to prove racial superiority. He failed at the racism but succeeded in proving that fingerprints were unique and permanent. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, and even a Victorian eugenicist could accidentally advance legitimate science. But Scotland Yard wasn't interested. They had the Bertillon system, 11 precise measurements, scientific calipers, French methodology. Why would they abandon their elaborate measurement system for something as simple as pressing fingers on ink? The resistance was spectacular. Senior officers declared fingerprinting undignified, measuring criminals with calipers perfectly reasonable. Making them touch ink? Absolutely not. What would the Queen think? The Home Office worried about the expense of ink and paper. Parliament debated whether forcing criminals to provide fingerprints violated their rights as Englishmen. Enter Edward Henry, an Inspector General of Police in Bengal, who'd been using fingerprinting since 1897 with remarkable success. He developed a classification system that made filing and retrieving prints actually practical. When he returned to England in 1901, he brought with him case files showing hundreds of crimes solved by fingerprinting. The establishment's response? Yes, but does it work on English criminals? The breakthrough came from the most Victorian of sources, a sensational murder case. In 1902, a burglar named Harry Jackson left his thumbprint on a freshly painted windowsill during a burglary in Denmark Hill. The jury was skeptical. The defense argued that fingerprint evidence was foreign nonsense. The prosecution had to bring in experts to explain loops, whorls, and arches to deeply confused jurors. But it worked. Jackson was convicted, and suddenly fingerprinting was all the rage. By 1902, Scotland Yard had established the Fingerprint Bureau, grudgingly admitting that perhaps those colonial administrators had been onto something. Officers had to be trained to take prints without smudging them, a skill that apparently required weeks of practice and numerous ruined cards. The filing system was a nightmare. Millions of prints classified by pattern types stored in wooden cabinets that regularly collapsed under their own weight. Early fingerprint powder was made from lampblack and mercury. Yes, mercury. Victorian investigators were literally poisoning themselves to dust for prints. The powder got everywhere. Early fingerprint officers looked like they'd been mining coal. Courtroom demonstrations often ended with prosecutors covered in black powder, trying to explain ridge patterns while looking like chimney sweeps. Criminals naturally tried to defeat the system. They burned their fingers with acid, cut them with knives, even tried grafting skin from other body parts. One enterprising burglar wore gloves made from human skin. Don't ask where he got it. None of it worked. Fingerprints, like Victorian prejudices, proved remarkably persistent. The real challenge was convincing juries. Prosecutors had to explain that no two people had identical fingerprints, not even twins, using charts that looked like abstract art. Defense attorneys argued it was witchcraft disguised as science. Judges fell asleep during technical explanations. One famous trial featured a fingerprint expert spending 3 days explaining the difference between a loop and a whorl to an increasingly hostile jury, but the results spoke for themselves. Burglary convictions soared. Repeat offenders could no longer simply give false names. The crime clearance rate in London jumped from 15% to nearly 40% within 5 years of implementing fingerprinting. Other countries watched Britain's success with interest and varying degrees of competence. The French insisted on improving the system by adding palm prints and toe prints, creating a bureaucratic nightmare. The Germans developed their own classification system just to be different. The Americans adopted fingerprinting enthusiastically, mainly for identifying immigrants, because priorities. By 1910, fingerprinting had conquered the world of criminal investigation. The Bertillon system was relegated to history, remembered only as that time we measured criminals' heads for science. Fingerprinting became so successful that criminals started wearing gloves, leading to the next arms race in criminal investigation. The fingerprint revolution succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was simple. No complex measurements, no subjective judgments about criminal facial features, just the unique patterns that everyone carried on their fingertips. It was democratic in a way that horrified Victorians. Duchesses and dustmen had equally unique prints. So that burglary in Denmark Hill? Within a decade it would be solved in hours, not weeks. A print would be lifted, compared to records, and the criminal identified before he could fence the stolen goods. It wasn't quite CSI, but compared to checking if corpses bled when touched by suspects, it was practically space-age technology. The fingerprint revolution. When criminal investigation finally found evidence that couldn't lie, couldn't be tortured into confession, and couldn't be faked. Unless you counted that guy with the human skin gloves, but we don't talk about him. From Roman slaves being tortured for testimony, to Victorian detectives dusting for fingerprints with mercury powder, humanity's quest to catch criminals has been a comedy of errors punctuated by moments of accidental genius. For most of human history, investigation was less about finding truth and more about finding someone to blame, preferably someone poor, foreign, or female. Yet somehow, through all the drownings, torturing, and measuring of criminal skulls, humanity slowly stumbled towards something resembling actual investigation. Each era built on the disasters of the previous one, from medieval coroners examining bodies to the Victorians embracing science, badly but still. The fingerprint revolution at the close of the 19th century seemed to be the culmination of this slow, painful, often ridiculous progress. But if millennia of history taught us anything, it's that human beings are spectacularly bad at catching criminals. As the 20th century dawned, things were about to get interesting. We were about to invent whole new ways to be incompetent, now with automobiles and telephones. It's 1902 in New York City, and you've just witnessed a murder outside a Bowery saloon. In the old days, you'd have raised a hue and cry, or maybe found a Bow Street runner to bribe. But this is modern America, baby. You're about to experience the cutting edge of turn-of-the-century police work. Corruption with better transportation. The early 1900s saw police departments actually becoming organized. The New York Police Department had grown from a loose collection of thugs with badges to a tight organization of thugs with badges, uniforms, and a pension plan. They had precincts, ranks, and even detective bureaus. They also had systematic corruption that would make the Bow Street runners blush. But corruption aside, genuine innovations were happening. The telephone, installed in major precinct houses by the 1880s, revolutionized investigation. For the first time in history, you could report a crime without physically running to find a constable. Of course, this assumed the desk sergeant wasn't too drunk to answer, the line wasn't busy, and you could afford a telephone. But progress is progress. The real game changer was the rogues gallery going high-tech. Police departments began using the Bertillon system, combined with photography, to create comprehensive criminal databases. Every arrested person was photographed, measured, and cataloged. The NYPD's gallery by 1900 contained over 100,000 photographs, organized by crime type, physical features, and neighborhood. Want to find all the pickpockets with facial scars who operated on the Lower East Side? There was a filing cabinet for that. Need burglars who were left-handed and over 6 feet tall? Check drawer 47B. It was like a criminal LinkedIn, but with worse photography and more mustaches. Detective work was becoming a profession rather than a side hustle. The NYPD established the Detective Bureau as a separate division, with actual training requirements. Well, training might be generous. It was more like, here's your badge. Don't take bribes too obviously, and try to solve something occasionally. These early detectives pioneered techniques that seem obvious now, but were revolutionary then: the stakeout. Detectives would actually watch locations where crimes were likely to occur. Revolutionary. Of course, stakeouts in 1902 meant standing in doorways, pretending to read newspapers, and hoping criminals didn't notice the obvious cop in the obvious cop suit obviously watching them. Undercover work became more sophisticated. Detectives would infiltrate gangs, sometimes for months. The Italian squad, formed to combat the Black Hand, early mafia, had detectives who spoke Italian and could blend in. Their reports make fascinating reading. Spent evening drinking wine with suspects. They discussed many crimes. I nodded knowingly. Forgot to take notes, will remember better next time. The third degree. Not exactly innovative, but American police perfected the art of enhanced interrogation. This could range from psychological pressure to what we'd now call torture. The rubber hose became the American detective's favorite tool. It left no marks but encouraged confessions wonderfully. As one detective manual advised, a suspect's memory often improves with assistance. But the early 1900s also saw the birth of scientific detection in America. Largely imported from Europe but given an American twist, meaning more violence and less accuracy. American police began experimenting with ballistics analysis. Detectives started keeping bullets from crime scenes and comparing them to test bullets. Their method? Squinting at them through magnifying glasses and declaring, "Yep, looks similar." It wasn't exactly precise, but it was better than the previous method of, "all bullets look the same." Blood analysis was in its infancy. Detectives could now tell human blood from animal blood, which was helpful in a city where butcher shops and murder scenes often looked similar. They couldn't type blood yet, but they could definitively say, "That's blood," instead of "That's probably blood," or "maybe wine." Toxicology advanced from taste the victim's lips to actual chemical tests. The Marsh test could detect arsenic, though it required equipment most police departments couldn't afford or operate. Many poisoners went free because the detective assigned to the case couldn't figure out the chemistry set. The real innovation of early 20th century American policing was the systematic approach to vice and organized crime. Cities were divided into precincts, each with its own detectives who knew their territory intimately. They knew which speakeasies paid protection, which gangs controlled which blocks, and which politicians not to investigate. This intimate knowledge was a double-edged sword. Detectives could solve crimes quickly because they knew all the local criminals. But they also knew which criminals paid well, leading to a system where investigation often meant negotiating who would take the fall rather than finding the actual perpetrator. The murder outside that Bowery saloon? Here's how it would go down. The responding officer would telephone the precinct. A detective would arrive via police wagon, or, if important enough, one of the department's new automobiles. He'd interview witnesses, focusing on those who seemed sober enough to remember. He'd check if the victim was known to police, probably, if they owed money to local gangs, definitely, and if anyone important cared about solving it, unlikely. If the victim was nobody special, the case would be marked death by misadventure, or blamed on the usual suspects. If the victim was connected, the detective would conduct a real investigation, checking the rogues gallery, leaning on informants, maybe even preserving physical evidence. The early 1900s were a time of transition. Old-style policing based on knowing everyone in your neighborhood was giving way to systematic investigation based on records, science, and procedure. But it was a messy transition, full of corruption, incompetence, and occasional brilliance. In other words, it was perfectly American. World War I did many horrible things, but it also accidentally revolutionized criminal investigation. When you're trying to identify hundreds of thousands of mangled corpses, determine which side used poison gas first, and figure out if that Belgian civilian is actually a German spy, you develop some pretty sophisticated investigative techniques. Who knew that global carnage could advance forensic science? It's 1919, and you're a detective in London dealing with a mysterious death. Before the war, you'd have checked for obvious wounds, asked around the neighborhood, and called it a day. But now you've got veterans who learned things in the trenches that would revolutionize policing. Unfortunately, they also learned how to kill people in ways you'd never imagined. The war created a perfect storm for investigative advancement. Millions of men needed identifying, often from partial remains. Chemical weapons required detection and analysis. Espionage made document examination crucial. And the sheer scale of death meant bureaucracy had to get efficient or drown in corpses. Let's start with identification. The war killed the Bertillon system once and for all. Try taking 11 precise measurements of someone who's been blown apart by artillery. Fingerprinting became essential, but even that had limitations when dealing with soldiers who no longer had fingers. This led to innovations in dental identification. Military dentists began keeping detailed records of soldiers' teeth, creating the foundation for forensic odontology. For the first time, you could identify someone by their dental work. Of course, this assumed they had dental work and still had teeth. But it was progress. The war also advanced photography dramatically. Crime scene photography before 1914 was artistic at best. One photo of the body, maybe one of the room, call it done. But military intelligence needed precise documentation. Every trench raid, gas attack, and suspicious death was photographed from multiple angles with measuring sticks for scale. These military photographers returned to civilian life with skills that transformed crime scene documentation. They introduced systematic photography, overall scene shots, medium-range context photos, close-ups of evidence. They used numbered markers to identify specific items. They even pioneered aerial photography for large crime scenes, using techniques developed for battlefield reconnaissance. But the real revolution came from poison gas. The war saw the first large-scale use of chemical weapons, and detecting them required sophisticated chemistry. Military scientists developed field tests for chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas that could provide results in minutes. After the war, these chemists brought their skills to civilian forensics. Suddenly, police labs could test for poisons that would have been undetectable before. They could identify accelerants in arson cases, analyze mysterious substances, and determine if that white powder was cocaine or just sugar. Taste testing was finally, mercifully, discontinued. The war also created a generation of investigators trained in intelligence work. Military intelligence officers learned surveillance, code breaking, document analysis, and interrogation techniques that made pre-war detective work look like amateur hour. They understood networks, patterns, and the importance of seemingly insignificant details. These veterans transformed police departments. They introduced military-style record-keeping, intelligence gathering, and systematic investigation. They also brought less savory skills. Enhanced interrogation techniques learned from prisoner questioning, surveillance methods developed for tracking spies, and a certain casual attitude toward violence that made the third degree seem quaint. Document examination became a science thanks to wartime espionage. Forged papers could mean the difference between a successful spy and a firing squad, so the military developed sophisticated techniques for detecting forgeries. Handwriting analysis, ink dating, paper composition all became standard investigative tools. The war even revolutionized communications. Military telephone and telegraph networks showed what was possible with coordinated communication. Police departments began installing more sophisticated phone systems, teleprinters for sharing information between cities, and even early radio communications. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. The war had shown that ordinary people could do extraordinary evil under the right circumstances. The optimistic Victorian belief in criminal types gave way to a darker understanding that anyone could be a killer. Investigation became less about identifying obvious criminal characteristics and more about understanding motive and opportunity. That mysterious death in 1919 London? The investigation would be transformed by war veterans. The photographer would document everything systematically. The chemist would test for exotic poisons some soldier brought back from France. The detective, probably a former intelligence officer, would approach it like a military operation, gathering intelligence, analyzing patterns, considering possibilities that pre-war police would never imagine. The body would be examined by a doctor who'd processed thousands of casualties, looking for wounds a civilian physician might miss. Dental records would be checked. Even the victim's clothing would be analyzed. Military quartermasters had become experts at identifying fabrics, dyes, and manufacturing origins. World War I gave criminal investigation its modern foundation. Systematic documentation, scientific analysis, and the grim understanding that humans were capable of anything. It was a terrible price to pay for progress, but then again, forensic science had always advanced through tragedy. The war to end all wars ended up beginning a new age of investigation, one where science trumped superstition, where documentation mattered more than intuition, and where the horrors of the trenches had prepared investigators for any civilian crime. Dark gifts from a dark time, but gifts nonetheless. If World War I modernized investigation techniques, Prohibition weaponized them. When America decided to ban alcohol in 1920, it accidentally created the most sophisticated criminal organizations in history. And when you're fighting criminals with Tommy guns, accountants, and lawyers, you need better investigative tools than a magnifying glass and a strong hunch. It's 1925 in Chicago, and you've just stumbled upon a crime scene that would make a medieval investigator weep with envy. 7 men lie dead in a garage, methodically executed with machine guns. This is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Yes, I know it's 1929, but similar scenes played out throughout the decade. And it's about to revolutionize how America investigates organized crime. The 1920s saw American law enforcement split into 2 distinct branches: local cops who were mostly corrupt, and federal agents who were mostly incompetent, but incompetent in new scientific ways. The Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, was trying to professionalize law enforcement, which meant less beating confessions out of suspects and more, actually, still quite a bit of beating, but now with proper documentation. The real innovation of the Prohibition era was the paper trail. Al Capone wasn't brought down by ballistics or fingerprints. He was convicted of tax evasion. This forced investigators to become accountants, following money through bank records, ledgers, and financial documents. It was boring as hell, but it worked. Elliot Ness and his untouchables weren't untouchable because they were immune to bullets. They weren't. But because they supposedly couldn't be bribed, they mostly couldn't. Their investigation techniques included surveillance that actually worked. Using automobiles and radios, agents could follow suspects across the city, coordinating via radio to avoid detection. Of course, when your surveillance vehicle is one of 3 cars in a neighborhood where everyone else uses horses, subtlety is relative. Wiretapping became an art form. Agents would climb telephone poles, splice into lines, and listen to conversations. It was completely illegal, but when has that stopped American law enforcement? The conversations they recorded were fascinating. "Hey Johnny, let's discuss our illegal alcohol operation in clear, easily prosecutable language." Financial investigation techniques that would make modern forensic accountants proud, following money through front companies, fake businesses, and coded ledgers. Agents learned to read between the lines of seemingly legitimate businesses. That flower shop ordering 10,000 roses a week? Probably not selling flowers. But Prohibition also advanced ballistic science, mainly because there were so many bullets to analyze. The Thompson submachine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute, giving investigators plenty of evidence to work with. Calvin Goddard pioneered the use of the comparison microscope for ballistics, allowing investigators to definitively match bullets to specific guns. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became a turning point. The sheer brutality, 7 men lined up and machine-gunned, shocked even violence-numbed Chicago. The investigation used every modern technique available. Crime scene photography that documented everything. Shell casings, blood patterns, the victims' positions. Over 70 photographs were taken, creating a comprehensive record that's still studied today. Ballistics analysis of the shell casings proved two different types of Tommy guns were used. Goddard's comparison microscope matched the bullets to specific weapons, though finding those weapons was another matter. Witness interviews, though these were hampered by the fact that witnesses in 1920s Chicago had remarkably poor memories when it came to identifying mobsters. Did you see who did it? No, officer. I was suddenly struck blind and deaf for exactly the duration of the massacre. The investigation even used early profiling. The methodical nature, the use of police uniforms as disguises, the choice of victims, all pointed to Capone's organization. Of course, proving it was another matter entirely. The 1920s also saw the rise of the crime lab. Chicago established one of the first in 1929, complete with ballistics analysis, chemical testing, and document examination. It was run by college-educated scientists rather than promoted beat cops, a revolutionary concept. These labs introduced actual science to investigation. Blood typing became standard, though it could only exclude suspects, not definitively identify them. Still, narrowing down suspects to type O was better than accusing everyone who looked shifty. Comparative analysis of everything, tire tracks, shoe prints, fabric fibers. If it could be collected and compared, it was. This led to warehouses full of reference samples. This is soil from every district in Chicago, in case we need to match dirt. Chemical analysis advanced beyond does this taste like poison. Spectrography could identify trace elements. Chromatography could separate complex mixtures. It was CSI's Chicago, just with more corruption and less DNA. The era also saw the birth of federal law enforcement as we know it. J. Edgar Hoover, whatever his many flaws, and there were many, professionalized the Bureau of Investigation. He introduced standardized training, created a national fingerprint database, and insisted on college-educated agents. Of course, he also illegally surveilled anyone he didn't like, kept secret files on politicians, and ran the FBI like a personal fiefdom. But his agents knew how to preserve a crime scene, and that was genuine progress. By the end of the 1920s, criminal investigation had entered the modern age. It was now a battle between organized crime with its lawyers and accountants, and law enforcement with its scientists and technicians. The rubber hose gave way to the comparison microscope. Following paper trails became as important as following suspects. That garage massacre in Chicago, it would generate thousands of pages of documentation, hundreds of photographs, detailed ballistics reports, and financial investigations that traced money through dozens of shell companies. It still wouldn't result in convictions. This was Chicago after all. But the investigation itself was light years from the check if the corpse bleeds days. The Roaring Twenties, when America learned that the best way to fight sophisticated criminals was with even more sophisticated investigation. And if that investigation happened to be illegal wiretapping and financial snooping, well, that was just the American way. The Depression-era desperados and scientific solutions. The 1930s hit America like a sock full of pennies, if you were lucky enough to have pennies. The Great Depression created a new breed of criminal, desperate, mobile, and armed with automatic weapons. But it also created a new breed of investigator, scientific, systematic, and backed by the full power of an increasingly powerful federal government. When John Dillinger robs banks across 3 states, you need more than local cops with nightsticks. It's 1934, and you're in the middle of the Great Plains watching a Ford V8 disappear in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a robbed bank and 2 dead guards. This is the era of the motorized bandit, and traditional law enforcement is about as effective as a chocolate teapot. But don't worry, J. Edgar Hoover's G-Men are on the case, and they've got science. The public enemy era forced law enforcement to evolve or become irrelevant. Criminals like Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Bonnie and Clyde weren't just robbing banks. They were outrunning, outgunning, and outthinking local police. They had fast cars, automatic weapons, and most importantly, they understood mass media. These weren't criminals, they were celebrities with body counts. The response was the federalization of law enforcement. The Bureau of Investigation became the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935, with expanded powers and resources. Hoover's FBI introduced innovations that seem obvious now but were revolutionary then. The 10 Most Wanted list, launched in 1930, turned criminal investigation into a public relations campaign. Suddenly, every citizen was a potential detective. Post offices became galleries of criminal portraiture. Of course, this also turned criminals into folk heroes, but marketing has always been a double-edged sword. National coordination became reality. The FBI created a central clearinghouse for information, connecting police departments across the country. A bank robber in Ohio could be tracked to Oklahoma without starting the investigation from scratch in each state. It was like a very slow, paper-based internet for cops. Scientific investigation got serious funding. The FBI laboratory, established in 1932, started with a single agent and a borrowed microscope. By decade's end, it was a state-of-the-art facility handling everything from handwriting analysis to early lie detector tests. Speaking of lie detectors, the 1930s saw the polygraph move from carnival sideshow to courtroom evidence. The Keeler polygraph, developed by Leonard Keeler, subtle naming, measured blood pressure, pulse, and respiration while subjects answered questions. It was about as reliable as a fortune teller, but it looked scientific with all those wiggling needles. The real revolution was in mobility and communication. Criminal gangs had cars. Law enforcement needed to catch up. Police departments invested in fast vehicles and two-way radios. For the first time, a patrol car could receive real-time updates. Suspect heading north on Route 66 actually meant something when you could relay it instantly. This mobility changed investigation techniques. Roadblocks became a science. Where to place them, how to coordinate them, how to stop a Ford V8 doing 80 miles per hour without getting shot. The FBI developed tactics that are still used today, though hopefully with less shooting. Multi-state coordination required new protocols. Jurisdiction became a maze of federal, state, and local authority. The solution? Make everything a federal crime. Crossing state lines in a stolen car became a federal offense. Fleeing across state lines to avoid prosecution? Federal crime. Looking suspicious near a state line? Probably a federal crime. The automobile itself became evidence. Tire tracks could be matched to specific manufacturers. Paint chips could identify make and model. Even dust on the undercarriage could reveal where a car had been. The FBI started maintaining databases of tire patterns and paint samples from every car manufacturer. But the biggest innovation was in public relations. Hoover understood that public support was crucial. The FBI cultivated an image of scientific, incorruptible law enforcement. G-men became heroes in movies and radio shows. The fact that many of these stories were wildly exaggerated or completely fictional didn't matter. The myth was more powerful than the reality. Take the Dillinger case. The investigation used every modern technique. Fingerprints from crime scenes were compared nationally. Dillinger's prints were on file from previous arrests, making identification certain. Of course, he kept escaping from jail, which somewhat undermined the triumph of identification. Informant networks reached new sophistication. The FBI paid well for information, leading to the famous Lady in Red who betrayed Dillinger. Modern investigation met ancient betrayal. Surveillance techniques improved dramatically. Agents learned to tail suspects in cars, coordinate via radio, and even conduct aerial surveillance. They still dressed like obvious federal agents, but at least they were obvious federal agents in automobiles. The scientific approach extended to crime scene investigation. The FBI promoted standardized procedures: secure the scene, photograph everything, collect physical evidence systematically. They even created portable crime scene kits with everything needed for proper investigation. Ballistics got even more sophisticated. The FBI lab could now match bullets not just to types of guns, but to specific weapons. They maintained a reference collection of every firearm manufactured, with sample bullets for comparison. Document examination became an art form. With kidnapping ransoms and extortion notes common, the ability to analyze handwriting, typewriters, and paper became crucial. The FBI's document examiners could identify specific typewriters from their quirks, match paper to manufacturers, and spot forgeries that would fool casual observers. By decade's end, criminal investigation had transformed from local cops chasing local criminals to a national system of scientific law enforcement. It wasn't perfect. The FBI's power was already concerning, scientific evidence was often overstated, and plenty of innocent people got caught in the dragnet. But compared to determining guilt by whether someone floated, it was practically utopian. That bank robbery in 1934? Within hours, the FBI would have tire track molds, ballistics evidence, and witness descriptions broadcast nationwide. The getaway car would be identified by paint chips and tire patterns. Fingerprints would be telegraphed to Washington for comparison. Roadblocks would be coordinated across state lines. The robbers would be on the 10 most wanted list within days. They'd probably still escape to Mexico, but the investigation would be thoroughly scientific about failing to catch them. World War II did for investigation what World War I had done, only more so. When you're fighting a global war where enemy spies could be anywhere, where sabotage threatened every factory, and where black market crime flourished like mushrooms in manure, everyone had to become an investigator. Paranoia became patriotism, and investigation techniques developed for battlefield intelligence came home to roost. It's 1943 in Los Angeles. You've just witnessed what might be a murder, or might be a suicide, or might be something more sinister involving those Japanese neighbors everyone's been suspecting since Pearl Harbor. Welcome to wartime investigation, where every crime might be espionage, and every citizen is both a potential detective and a potential suspect. The war transformed American law enforcement in ways that would echo for decades. The FBI, already powerful, became a domestic intelligence agency. Local police departments gained new powers and lost old restraints. And ordinary citizens were recruited into the investigation business, whether they wanted to be or not. The major innovation? Total surveillance became acceptable, even patriotic. The government encouraged citizens to report suspicious activity. Loose lips sink ships wasn't just about keeping secrets. It was about listening for others' secrets. Your gossipy neighbor was now a government asset. This citizen surveillance was systematized. Block wardens monitored their neighborhoods for blackout violations, but also for suspicious behavior. That new neighbor who worked odd hours? Worth reporting. The family that spoke German at home? Definitely worth reporting. The guy who bought extra sugar? Probably a black marketeer, but maybe a saboteur. Defense plant workers underwent background investigations that make modern security clearances look casual. Investigators examined not just criminal records, but political affiliations, reading habits, and social connections. Being seen at the wrong meeting in 1935 could cost you a job in 1943. Mail censorship became routine. Letters to and from overseas were opened, read, and analyzed. Investigators looked for coded messages, suspicious phrases, or just interesting gossip. It was like the NSA, but with steam and letter openers. The war also accelerated scientific investigation. The FBI laboratory expanded enormously, developing new techniques for everything from explosive analysis to code breaking. When you're investigating potential sabotage, you need to know if that factory explosion was an accident or enemy action. Document examination reached new heights. With rationing came fraud, and investigators became experts at spotting fake ration cards, altered documents, and forged identification. They developed techniques for detecting erased writing, chemical alterations, and sophisticated forgeries. Photographic surveillance advanced dramatically. Hidden cameras, telephoto lenses, and infrared film allowed investigators to document activities without being detected. The same techniques used to photograph enemy installations were perfect for documenting black market transactions. But the real innovation was in criminal profiling and behavioral analysis. The military's experience with intelligence analysis created a generation of investigators who understood patterns, networks, and psychology. The war created new crimes that required new investigative approaches. Black market investigation became a major focus. With rationing in effect, everything from gasoline to girdles was restricted. Investigators had to trace complex networks of illegal goods, often involving otherwise law-abiding citizens. That nice butcher who always had extra meat? He was running a criminal enterprise. Sabotage investigation required understanding both criminal behavior and industrial processes. When a factory machine broke down, investigators had to determine if it was wear, worker error, or enemy action. This led to early failure analysis techniques that would later become standard in aviation and industry. Espionage investigation reached levels of sophistication that pre-war cops couldn't imagine. The FBI developed techniques for surveillance, counter-surveillance, and double agents. They learned to track radio transmissions, decode messages, and identify spy equipment. The war also broke down barriers between agencies. Military intelligence, FBI, local police, and even private security had to cooperate. This forced standardization of procedures and sharing of techniques. A military intelligence officer's method for analyzing aerial photographs could help a police detective understand crime scene photos. Perhaps most importantly, the war normalized extensive record keeping. Everyone had identification papers, ration cards, draft cards, and employment records. This paper trail made investigation easier, but also created the expectation that the government could and should track everyone's activities. That possible murder in LA? The investigation would be thorough beyond pre-war imagination. The victim's background would be exhaustively investigated. Were they foreign-born? Did they have political affiliations? Had they expressed anti-war sentiments? Their mail would be reviewed, their associates questioned, their employment history examined. The crime scene would be processed using techniques developed for battlefield intelligence. Photographs from multiple angles, detailed sketches, careful collection of physical evidence. Was anything missing that might have military value? Were there signs of a struggle that suggested trained combat? Witnesses would be questioned not just about what they saw, but about their own backgrounds. Investigators had learned that witness reliability could be affected by political beliefs, national origin, and war-related stress. That traumatized defense worker might be seeing saboteurs everywhere. The investigation would coordinate across agencies. FBI for possible espionage angles, military intelligence if defense facilities were involved, local police for regular criminal possibilities. Information would flow up and down hierarchies in ways that would have been impossible before the war. By 1945, American law enforcement had been militarized, federalized, and scientificized, if that's a word. Investigation techniques developed for warfare became standard police procedure. The expectation of privacy had been fundamentally altered. Everyone was watching everyone, and that was considered normal. The war ended, but these changes didn't. The surveillance state, scientific investigation, and interagency cooperation born from military necessity became permanent features of American law enforcement. We'd won the war, But in the process, we'd all become suspects in the piece. The 1950s arrived with the subtlety of a nuclear bomb, which was fitting since everyone was terrified of actual nuclear bombs. The Cold War transformed criminal investigation into something that would have made George Orwell say, "I told you so," while smoking his victory pipe. When your neighbor could be a communist spy and your television could be broadcasting mind control rays, according to some particularly creative paranoids, investigation techniques had to evolve. Again, it's 1953 in Washington, D.C., and you've just witnessed what appears to be a simple mugging gone wrong. But is it? In the atomic age, nothing was simple. That mugger could be eliminating a nuclear scientist. That victim could be a Soviet agent. That briefcase lying in the gutter might contain atomic secrets or just a sad sandwich. Welcome to investigation in the age of mutually assured destruction. The 1950s saw investigation techniques split into two distinct branches: regular crime fighting, which got increasingly scientific, and anti-communist paranoia, which got increasingly insane. Sometimes these branches intertwined in ways that would be hilarious if they weren't so terrifying. Let's start with the genuinely progressive developments. Forensic science finally became actual science. The FBI laboratory was now processing over 100,000 pieces of evidence annually. They had specialists in everything from blood spatter to bomb fragments. More importantly, courts were starting to accept scientific evidence as more reliable than eyewitness testimony, which was revolutionary given that eyewitness testimony is about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. The polygraph reached peak popularity, despite being essentially an anxiety detector dressed up as a truth machine. Everyone from job applicants to suspected spies was being polygraphed. The questions were amazing. Have you ever harbored communist sympathies? Do you engage in sexual perversion? Have you ever thought about overthrowing the government? Sweating during these questions was considered suspicious, as if being asked about your sex life by a government agent wasn't naturally sweat-inducing. Crime scene investigation became standardized. The FBI published manuals that local police departments actually read, sometimes. There were now protocols for everything: how to photograph blood spatter, how to collect hair samples, how to preserve footprint impressions. It was like a very morbid cookbook. But the real innovations came from the paranoid side. Surveillance technology exploded. Miniature cameras, hidden microphones, telephone taps. If it could spy on someone, it was being developed. The CIA and FBI competed to create the smallest, most sophisticated bugs. They hid microphones in everything: lamp fixtures, picture frames, even inside a gift wooden seal hung in the U.S. ambassador's Moscow residence. The Russians were playing the same game. Background investigations became an art form. Want a government job? Investigators would interview your kindergarten teacher about your finger painting choices. They'd analyze your library records, your magazine subscriptions, your organizational memberships. Being in the wrong book club in college could derail your career 20 years later. Behavioral analysis got weird. The FBI developed profiles not just of criminals, but of subversives. Homosexuals were considered security risks. Intellectuals were suspicious. Anyone who read the wrong books, attended the wrong meetings, or associated with the wrong people could be investigated. It was like criminal profiling, but for thought crime. The real revolution was in information management. The FBI's filing system became legendary, and not in a good way. They maintained files on millions of Americans who had committed no crimes but had somehow attracted attention. These files were cross-referenced, indexed, and updated constantly. It was Facebook, but run by paranoid government agents and powered by index cards. New investigative techniques emerged from this paranoia. Mail covers, recording all information on the outside of envelopes without opening them. Technically legal, thoroughly creepy. Investigators could build detailed pictures of your social network just from your correspondence patterns. Trash analysis became standard. Your garbage was a gold mine of information: what you ate, what you read, what you threw away. One person's trash was the FBI's treasure trove. Investigators became archaeological experts in recent garbage. Financial surveillance reached new sophistication. Bank records, credit reports, tax returns all became fair game for investigation. Following money trails led not just to criminals but to anyone deemed subversive. Donating to the wrong charity could launch an investigation. The era also saw the birth of computer-assisted investigation, though computer meant room-sized machines that could sort punch cards. The FBI began digitizing fingerprint records, creating databases that could be searched faster than manual methods. It might take days instead of weeks to match a print. Progress. Psychological operations entered law enforcement. Investigators learned techniques from military intelligence: how to break someone psychologically, how to plant doubts, how to turn friends against each other. The interrogation room became a psychological battlefield. That mugging in D.C.? Here's how the investigation would unfold. First, determine if the victim was anyone important. Government employee? Scientist? Recent immigrant from Eastern Europe? If yes, escalate immediately. If no, proceed with normal investigation, but keep eyes open for communist angles. Process the scene using the latest techniques. Photograph everything. Collect physical evidence in new plastic bags. Revolutionary. Take impressions of footprints using dental plaster. Dust for fingerprints using new magnetic powders that actually worked. Run background checks on everyone involved: the victim, witnesses, even the beat cop who responded. Check FBI files. There were always files, employment records, organizational memberships. That witness who saw everything? Why was he in that neighborhood? Who does he associate with? Is his cousin's friend's barber a suspected communist? Interview witnesses using new psychological techniques. Note not just what they say, but how they say it. Body language analysis was becoming standard. Does the witness touch his nose when describing the mugger? Clearly lying. Or maybe just has allergies. Better investigate both possibilities. Check if any similar crimes fit a pattern. The FBI's new Crime Statistics Division could identify trends across jurisdictions. Was this part of a communist plot to eliminate government workers? Probably not, but let's create a task force just in case. The 1950s, when criminal investigation got sophisticated enough to catch actual criminals and paranoid enough to suspect everyone of being one. It was the best of times for forensic science and the worst of times for civil liberties. But hey, at least they'd stop throwing people in rivers to see if they float. Now they just polygraphed them about their political beliefs and sexual preferences. Progress comes in many forms. The 1960s arrived like a kaleidoscope explosion in a conservative Tea Party. Suddenly, investigators weren't just dealing with regular criminals and suspected communists. They had to figure out hippies, civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and a youth culture that seemed determined to break every rule their parents had carefully polygraphed into place. When everyone's growing their hair long and dropping acid, how do you even identify suspects anymore? It's 1967, in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. You've just witnessed what might be a murder, but the witness testimonies range from "I saw a cosmic butterfly commit the deed" to "Capitalism killed him, man." The victim might be a drug dealer, a narc, a runaway, or just someone who took the wrong pill. Welcome to investigation in the age of Aquarius, where the old rules don't apply and the new rules are written in tie-dye. The 1960s forced law enforcement to evolve in contradictory directions. On one hand, forensic science made genuine leaps forward. On the other, social upheaval made traditional investigation techniques about as useful as a chocolate teapot at Woodstock. The scientific advances were real, Gas chromatography became standard in crime labs, allowing precise identification of drugs and poisons. This was crucial when the streets were flooded with new synthetic drugs that traditional tests couldn't identify. Is this LSD or just paper? Was an actual investigative question. Voice-print analysis emerged, claiming to identify individuals by their speech patterns. It was sold as being as reliable as fingerprinting, which was a lie, but courts bought it anyway. The technology was primarily used to identify voices on wiretaps, which were still totally illegal but somehow kept happening. Blood analysis advanced beyond simple typing. Enzymes and proteins in blood could now narrow down suspects further. Still couldn't identify individuals uniquely, but it was getting closer. The killer has type O blood and PGM2-1 sounded very scientific in court. Computers entered investigation in a meaningful way. By the late 1960s, the FBI's National Crime Information Center, NCIC, could share information between agencies in real time. Well, real time meaning minutes instead of days. A stolen car in New York could be identified in Los Angeles within an hour. The future had arrived, and it ran on magnetic tape. But the social changes created new investigative challenges. Undercover work became essential but complicated. Infiltrating a traditional criminal gang was one thing. You just had to act tough and know the lingo. Infiltrating a hippie commune or activist group required growing your hair, learning about Marx and meditation, and convincingly dropping acid without actually dropping acid, usually. The generation gap became an investigation gap. Older detectives literally couldn't understand the culture they were investigating. Slang changed weekly. Fashion made identification difficult. Suspect is a white male with long hair and beads. Described roughly 40% of people under 30. Protest policing required new techniques. How do you investigate a crime when there are 10,000 potential suspects at a demonstration? Mass photography became standard. Police photographed every protester, creating vast files of potential subversives. It was like the 1950s, but with better cameras and worse fashion. Drug investigation became a major focus, but the old techniques didn't work. Traditional criminals had hierarchies, territories, and patterns. Hippie drug dealers operated on trust, vibes, and a complex barter economy. Following money trails was useless when deals were made in trade for macrame and vegetarian recipes. The era saw the birth of what would become SWAT teams. When groups like the Black Panthers armed themselves, police responded with military-style units. Investigation by dynamic entry became a thing. Why gather evidence slowly when you could kick down doors with overwhelming force? New laws created new investigative needs. The Miranda ruling in 1966 meant investigators had to actually follow rules about informing suspects of their rights. This was revolutionary. Police had to tell criminals they didn't have to talk. Madness. Investigators had to learn to build cases with evidence, rather than just confessions. Technology got both better and weirder. Surveillance equipment miniaturized. Bugs got smaller, cameras got sneakier, and wiretaps got more sophisticated. The FBI developed a microphone that could hear through walls by measuring vibrations. They also developed vans disguised as flower delivery trucks, which fooled nobody in neighborhoods where flowers were never delivered. Aerial surveillance became standard for large gatherings. Police helicopters with cameras monitored protests, love-ins, and rock concerts. They took thousands of photos of people doing nothing illegal but looking suspicious by existing in groups. Computer databases expanded to track not just criminals but persons of interest. Being at the wrong protest, subscribing to the wrong magazine, or dating the wrong person could get you a file. The FBI's COINTELPRO program took investigation beyond law enforcement into active disruption of legal political activities. That murder in Haight-Ashbury? The investigation would be a comedy of errors and evolution. First, identify the victim. No ID? Check missing persons reports nationwide via NCIC. Still nothing? Photograph the body and circulate through the underground press. Someone's commune is missing a member. Interview witnesses, understanding that everyone's probably high. Develop new interview techniques for people whose concept of linear time has been chemically adjusted. When did this happen? Time is an illusion, man. Okay, but was it before or after dinner? Process the scene using new techniques for drug-related crimes. Test every surface for drug residue. Collect roach clips as evidence. Try to determine if that's blood or just spilled beet juice from someone's macrobiotic diet. Go undercover if necessary. Grow hair, wear beads, learn to say groovy convincingly. Attend love-ins and be-ins hoping someone discusses the murder. Realize that nobody talks about anything comprehensible at these events. Use new computer systems to check if similar crimes have occurred. Discover that hippie murdered in drug deal describes dozens of cases. Narrow it down by specific details like victim was wearing purple velvet pants. Still dozens of cases. Consider that the murder might be political. Was the victim an informant? An activist? Check FBI files. Everyone had files by now. Coordinate with federal agencies who are also investigating everyone for everything. The 1960s transformed investigation from a straightforward process of following evidence to a complex navigation of cultural divides, new technologies, and expanding surveillance. It was progress, but messy, complicated progress that raised as many questions as it answered. Like, if everyone's watching everyone, who's watching the watchers? That question would only get louder in the 1970s. The 70s, when investigation got serious and seriously corrupt. If the 1960s were about peace and love, the 1970s were about disillusionment and polyester. Nixon was wiretapping everyone, cities were broke, crime was soaring, and investigators were trying to solve murders with computers the size of refrigerators. The age of surveillance had arrived, but it was analog surveillance, tape recorders, film cameras, and filing cabinets stuffed with enough paper to rebuild a forest. It's 1975 in New York City. The city is basically Batman's Gotham without Batman. You've just witnessed a murder on the subway, but half the witnesses fled because they have warrants. The other half don't trust cops, and the subway car is covered in so much graffiti that finding evidence is like solving a magic eye puzzle. Welcome to investigation in the decade that taste forgot. The 1970s saw criminal investigation pulled in two directions: genuine scientific advancement and spectacular institutional corruption. It was the best of times for forensic science and the worst of times for trusting law enforcement. The scientific leaps were remarkable. Scanning electron microscopes, SEM, entered crime labs, allowing investigators to match bullets, fibers, and particles with unprecedented precision. You could now prove that specific fiber came from a specific polyester shirt, narrowing suspects down to only everyone who shopped at Sears. Tape enhancement technology evolved for military applications. The Watergate tapes weren't just politically significant. They showed that audio evidence could be enhanced, analyzed, and used to take down a president. If it could catch Nixon, it could catch anybody. Crime labs rushed to buy equipment that could clean up muddy recordings, isolate voices, and detect edits. Early DNA work began, though it wouldn't be courtroom ready until the 1980s. Scientists were figuring out that blood and semen contained genetic markers beyond just blood type. It was like fingerprints, but squishier. Labs started preserving biological evidence better, knowing that future technology might unlock it. Composite sketching got sophisticated. Instead of draw what the witness describes, artists used facial feature catalogs. Witnesses could flip through pages of noses, eyes, and mouths like the world's worst fashion magazine. The results actually look like humans instead of potatoes with hair. But the institutional changes were equally dramatic. The war on drugs militarized investigation. The DEA was established in 1973, combining various drug enforcement agencies into one super agency with broad powers. Drug investigations got budgets that made other detectives weep. Suddenly, every department needed a narcotics unit, undercover officers, and paid informants. Undercover work became long-term and dangerous. Officers spent months or years infiltrating drug operations, motorcycle gangs, and radical groups. They grew their hair, got tattoos, and sometimes forgot which side they were on. Deep cover operations created psychological problems nobody had anticipated. Informant networks expanded beyond anything imagined. The FBI alone had thousands of paid informants. Some were criminals getting reduced sentences, others were citizens getting cash. The quality of information varied from excellent to "I made it up for drug money." Serial killer investigation became a specialty. The term serial killer was coined in the 1970s, and the FBI began developing psychological profiling. The Behavioral Science Unit interviewed imprisoned killers, trying to understand patterns. Ted Bundy, active throughout the decade, showed how mobile killers could exploit jurisdictional confusion. Technology got impressive and creepy. CCTV began appearing, though it was closed circuit in the most literal sense. Cameras watched specific locations, banks, government buildings, some stores, recording on tape that had to be changed every few hours. Quality was terrible, but it was better than eyewitness descriptions of medium height, medium build, medium everything. Computer databases expanded dramatically. NCIC added more categories: stolen securities, missing persons, gang members. The FBI's identification division was computerizing millions of fingerprint cards. Searches that once took weeks could be done in days. Still couldn't search partial prints effectively, but progress is progress. Wiretapping reached new sophistication. Post-Watergate laws supposedly restricted it, but technology made it easier. Pen registers recorded every number dialed. Trap and trace identified incoming calls. Bugs got smaller, transmitters got stronger, and everybody was paranoid about being recorded because everybody probably was. Financial investigation became crucial as organized crime got organized. Following money required understanding international banking, shell companies, and money laundering. The RICO Act, 1970, gave investigators tools to pursue entire criminal organizations, not just individual crimes. But corruption was everywhere. The Knapp Commission exposed massive corruption in the NYPD. Detectives were on the take, investigations were killed for money, and evidence disappeared regularly. The French Connection heroin, hundreds of pounds of evidence, vanished from the NYPD property room. Investigation of the investigators became necessary. COINTELPRO revelations showed the FBI had been illegally investigating, infiltrating, and disrupting political groups for decades. Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, feminists, all had been targets. The line between criminal investigation and political persecution had been thoroughly erased. Local police departments were broke and cutting corners. Evidence storage was abysmal. Rape kits went untested. Property rooms were chaos. Chain of custody was more suggestion than rule. Defense attorneys had field days pointing out procedural failures. That subway murder in 1975 New York? Here's the investigation reality. First, secure the scene. It's a moving subway car covered in graffiti, bodily fluids of unknown origin, and decades of grime. Photograph it anyway, with your department's one working camera. Interview witnesses who don't want to be involved. Most give fake names and addresses. The ones who stay either saw nothing or have elaborate stories involving conspiracies. Document everything anyway. Look for physical evidence. Find 17 knives, standard subway equipment, various drugs, and enough fingerprints to populate a small country. Lift prints from the few clean surfaces. Send to the lab where they'll be processed sometime next year. Check if victim is in any databases. Run name through NCIC, local records, DEA databases. Probably has a record. Probably knew his killer. Probably drug-related, because everything in 1975 is drug-related. Canvass the neighborhood where he lived. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knows anything. Everybody's cousin might know something, but they're not home right now and won't be ever. Hope your informants hear something. Pay them for information. Realize half of it is made up, but follow leads anyway. Conduct surveillance with your department's 2 working unmarked cars that everyone recognizes. If lucky, make an arrest. If very lucky, have enough evidence for trial that hasn't been contaminated, lost, or sold from the evidence room. The 1970s, when investigation got the tools to be truly effective and the corruption to be truly awful. Every technological advancement was matched by an institutional failure. It was progress, but the kind that made you nostalgic for simpler times, when police just beat confessions out of people instead of illegally wiretapping them for years. The pre-digital 80s, the last gasp of analog investigation. The 1980s arrived with the grace of a cocaine-fueled stockbroker, loud, confident, and leaving white powder everywhere. This was the last decade before digital technology would transform investigation forever, but nobody knew that yet. Instead, investigators were perfecting analog techniques to their absolute peak while dealing with new crimes that made the 1970s look quaint. Crack cocaine, serial killers with frequent flyer miles, and Wall Street criminals who actually understood their own crimes. Welcome to the decade of excess, including excessive crime. It's 1985 in Miami, and you've just stumbled on to what appears to be a drug-related murder. Appears to be, because in 1985 Miami, every murder was drug-related until proven otherwise. The victim has more gold chains than neck, the crime scene has more cocaine residue than a Studio 54 bathroom, and the witnesses all have lawyers on speed dial. This is investigation in the Reagan era, where the drugs are stronger, the criminals are richer, and the hair is inexplicably bigger. The 1980s represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-digital investigation. Everything was bigger, more sophisticated, but still fundamentally analog. DNA profiling finally arrived in 1984, courtesy of British geneticist Alec Jeffreys. The first DNA conviction came in 1987. Suddenly, biological evidence could identify individuals as uniquely as fingerprints. The catch? The process took weeks, required pristine samples, and cost more than most departments' annual budgets. But it was revolutionary. You could finally prove someone was at a scene through their spit, blood, or other fluids best not discussed. Computer databases reached new sophistication while still running on systems that would lose to a modern calculator. AFIS, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, could search partial prints across millions of records. It only took hours instead of months. The computers were room-sized, required special cooling, and crashed if you looked at them wrong. But progress is progress. The FBI's VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, launched in 1985, attempting to link serial crimes across jurisdictions. It was essentially a dating app for murders. Input your crime's characteristics and see if any similar crimes matched. Like most 1980s computer dating, the results were mixed. Forensic accounting became crucial as criminals got MBAs. The S&L crisis, insider trading, and money laundering required investigators who understood spreadsheets as well as bloodstains. Follow the money became more complex when the money went through 17 shell companies in the Caymans. The war on drugs reached hysteria levels. Crack cocaine created a new type of crime wave. Unlike powder cocaine for rich people, crack was cheap, addictive, and everywhere. Investigation techniques had to adapt to street-level dealing, where traditional organized crime hierarchies didn't apply. Your local crack dealer wasn't part of a family. He was an entrepreneur with a gun. Asset forfeiture became a major investigative tool. Police could seize property suspected of being drug-related. Suspected, not proven. This led to the bizarre situation where property was prosecuted, United States v. 1 1987 Porsche 911, and had to prove its own innocence. It also funded police departments, creating interesting incentives. Surveillance technology hit new heights. Departments got military surplus equipment. Night vision, thermal imaging, and aerial surveillance became standard for drug investigations. The Fourth Amendment wept quietly in the corner while police filmed your heat signature through walls. Informants became industrialized. Major investigations ran dozens of CIs, confidential informants, many working off their own charges. The quality of information varied from excellent to whatever keeps me out of prison. Managing informant networks became a full-time job. Serial killer investigation got sophisticated. Psychological profiling matured from educated guessing to educated guessing with statistics. The FBI's behavioral science unit developed detailed profiles: organized versus disorganized killers, signature versus MO, cooling off periods. It wasn't quite Silence of the Lambs, but it was getting there. VICAP tried to connect murders across jurisdictions, fighting the serial killer's best friend: bureaucratic incompetence. Different departments finally shared information, though usually after several murders too many. Task forces became standard for high-profile cases. Multiple agencies working together, sharing resources, and definitely not fighting over jurisdiction and credit. The Green River Killer Task Force showed both the potential and problems of this approach. Media relations became crucial. Serial killers were media gold, and investigators learned to use publicity strategically. Press conferences, hotlines, and America's Most Wanted turned citizens into tipsters. Quality varied, but quantity had its own value. Financial crime investigation evolved with the crimes. White-collar investigation required new skills. Investigators needed to understand derivatives, junk bonds, and financial instruments that seemed designed to confuse. The savings and loan crisis produced crimes so complex that investigators needed accountants to explain what laws were broken. Computer crime emerged as a category. Hacking was moving from war games fantasy to reality. Early computer forensics involved printing out code and hoping someone could read BASIC. Most departments treated computer crime like witchcraft, mysterious and probably involving teenagers. International crime became common. Drugs from Colombia, money to Switzerland, criminals to non-extradition countries. Investigation had to go global, while still using telexes and international phone calls that cost fortunes. Technology reached its analog peak. Fax machines revolutionized information sharing. You could send documents instantly, well, over several minutes, if the phone line was clear, and the receiving machine had paper, and nobody picked up the phone mid-transmission. But still, instant. Video surveillance improved dramatically. VHS quality, multiple cameras, time-lapse recording. You could actually identify suspects instead of just confirming, yes, that's a human-shaped blob. Banks, stores, and government buildings became forests of cameras. Mobile phones appeared but were too expensive and rare for most investigations. Criminals with cell phones were either very successful or very stupid. Usually both. Tracking them required warrant-approved cooperation from the 3 people who owned cell towers. Forensic science hit new peaks. Hair analysis became standard, though its reliability was questionable. Investigators could determine race, whether hair was pulled or cut, and if it was treated. They couldn't actually match it to individuals reliably, but juries didn't know that. Ballistics got computerized. Not fully digital, but automated comparison microscopes could suggest possible matches. An examiner still had to confirm, but searching became faster. Toxicology expanded to designer drugs. Labs had to keep up with chemists creating new substances weekly. Is this cocaine? Became, is this one of 17 cocaine analogs that didn't exist last month? That Miami murder in 1985? Process the scene with the latest technology. Photograph with actual good cameras. Video with VHS camcorders. Dust for prints using magnetic powder that actually works. Collect biological evidence knowing DNA might identify the killer. Run everything through databases. Fingerprints through AFIS. Ballistics through DrugFire. Check if the victim's in NCIC, DA databases, or just the phone book. In Miami, check all three. Use financial investigation to follow drug money, subpoena bank records, trace cash deposits. Realize everyone in Miami is depositing suspicious amounts of cash. Narrow it down to very suspicious amounts. Deploy surveillance on suspects. Use night vision, telephone pen registers, maybe even plan a tracker on their car, those new electronic beepers that sometimes work. Have teams ready because suspects definitely have scanners listening to police radios. Coordinate with federal agencies, DEA for drugs, FBI for interstate crimes, ATF for the inevitable automatic weapons. Try not to step on each other's investigations. Fail. Argue about jurisdiction while criminals escape to Colombia. Build case with actual evidence, not just confessions. DNA from blood, fingerprints from cocaine packaging, financial records showing inexplicable wealth. Present to jury using cutting-edge technology like color photocopies and overhead projectors. The 1980s were investigation's last analog hurrah. Every technique was refined to its maximum potential. Databases were comprehensive but still searched by hand. Surveillance was sophisticated but still required human eyes. Forensics were advanced but still took weeks. It was the end of an era, though nobody knew it yet. In a few years, digital technology would change everything. But in the 1980s, investigators were analog artists at the peak of their craft, solving crimes with room-sized computers, shoulder-mounted video cameras, and mobile phones that required a briefcase. Looking back, it seems almost quaint. But these were the techniques that caught serial killers, broke drug cartels, and prosecuted financial criminals. All without a single megapixel or GPS tracker. The analog age of investigation, when finding a criminal required actual detective work instead of just checking their Facebook. And so we reached the end of our journey through the pre-CCTV age of criminal investigation. From Roman slaves tortured for testimony to 1980s detectives using room-sized computers, we've seen humanity slowly, painfully, often hilariously evolve better ways to catch criminals. What strikes you looking back is how recent most of our investigative tools really are. For most of human history, determining guilt was less about evidence and more about whoever could afford the best accusation, or float properly, or survive being pressed with stones. The idea that physical evidence could tell a story, that science could determine truth, that investigation should follow procedures rather than prejudices. These are modern inventions, younger than television. We went from trial by ordeal to DNA profiling in less than 1,000 years. That's barely a blink in human history, but what a blink it was. We replaced drowning suspects with documenting crime scenes. We traded supernatural judgments for scientific analysis. We evolved from assuming guilt based on appearance to requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt. Sometimes, the journey wasn't smooth. Every advance came with setbacks. Fingerprinting was used to categorize criminal types. Psychological profiling reinforced biases. Surveillance meant for catching criminals expanded to monitoring citizens. Each tool designed to find truth was also capable of manufacturing lies. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about pre-CCTV investigation was how human it remained. Without omnipresent cameras, investigation required talking to people, understanding motivations, following paper trails, and yes, occasionally getting lucky. Detectives had to be part scientist, part psychologist, part accountant, and part gambler. They solved crimes through patience and shoe leather, through informants and intuition, through slowly building cases one piece of evidence at a time. It was messy, often corrupt, frequently wrong, but undeniably human. When everyone wasn't on camera every moment, investigation required understanding people, not just tracking them. Soon, CCTV would change everything. Those grainy cameras would multiply into the millions, watching every street corner, every shop, every public space. Digital technology would transform investigation from art to algorithm. DNA databases, facial recognition, cell phone tracking, internet histories. The digital age would make everyone traceable, trackable, findable. But before all that, before we all became stars of our own surveillance shows, investigation was a fundamentally different beast. It was slower, harder, more prone to error, but also more dependent on human skill and judgment. A good detective in 1985 couldn't just pull up footage. They had to think, deduce, investigate. So the next time you walk past a CCTV camera, one of millions watching our every move, remember what came before. Remember the centuries when catching a criminal meant more than rewinding tape. Remember when investigation was an art, not just an algorithm. From floating witches to DNA profiling, from trial by ordeal to psychological profiles, from hue and cry to APBs, we've come so far. Whether we've come in the right direction is another question entirely. But one thing's certain, the next time you complain about surveillance society, at least be grateful nobody's checking if you float properly when tied thumb to toe. That's progress. Probably.